She boarded the flight broken, tears streaming down her face, hiding a secret no one could know. When both pilots collapsed and panic filled the cabin, passengers screamed knowing death was certain. Then the crying woman in seat 9B whispered 4 words that would save everyone, or doom them all. Her hands hadn't touched controls in 5 forbidden years. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The woman in seat 9B had been crying since boarding, her face pressed against the cold airplane window as silent tears carved paths down her cheeks. The other passengers noticed her immediately, the way her shoulders trembled with suppressed sobs, how she clutched a crumpled tissue in her white-knuckled fist, the devastation that seemed to radiate from her small frame like heat from asphalt on a summer day. They looked away quickly, granting her the privacy that grief demands, making assumptions about what could break a person so completely at 30,000 feet. A death in the family, perhaps a marriage ending. Some unbearable loss that made boarding this aircraft feel like the only escape available, even if escape meant nothing more than putting distance between herself and whatever had shattered her so thoroughly. The flight attendants checked on her periodically with gentle voices and concerned eyes, offering water she didn't drink and blankets she didn't need. She thanked them in a voice barely above a whisper, then returned to her window, to her tears, to whatever private hell she carried with her into the sky. Nobody knew her name was Sarah Mitchell. Nobody knew she was 37 years old and that she'd spent the last 5 years trying to figure out who she was without the one thing that had defined her entire adult life. Nobody knew that the tears streaming down her face weren't about personal tragedy in the conventional sense, but about the slow death of identity, the excruciating process of mourning yourself while still breathing. Sarah had been an airline captain. Not just any captain, but one of the youngest women to command a commercial aircraft for a major carrier, a pilot whose skill and precision had earned respect in a profession that didn't grant it easily. She'd accumulated over 8,000 flight hours, had landed in crosswinds that would terrify most pilots, had navigated weather systems and mechanical failures with the kind of calm competence that made passengers feel safe even when circumstances suggested they shouldn't. Flying hadn't been her job, it had been her identity, her purpose, the thing that made sense of everything else in her life. The cockpit had been her sanctuary, the controls an extension of her own hands, the sky a place where everything that felt complicated on the ground became beautifully, perfectly simple. Then came the incident. 5 years ago, during a routine approach into Chicago O'Hare, she'd made a decision, one small error in judgment during an abnormal situation that resulted in a hard landing. Nobody died. Nobody was even seriously injured, just some bruises and one fractured wrist from a passenger who hadn't properly fastened their seatbelt. The aircraft sustained reparable damage. An investigation followed, as investigations always did, and the conclusion was that she'd made the wrong choice under pressure, had failed to execute proper emergency procedures, had endangered her passengers through pilot error. The Federal Aviation Administration had revoked her medical certificate based on the psychological evaluation that followed, determining that she'd experienced acute stress reaction during the emergency and that her fitness to command an aircraft was compromised. Depression, they'd called it. Anxiety disorder, emotional instability unsuitable for the demands of commercial aviation. She'd fought the decision through every available channel, had appealed and petitioned and begged, but the verdict remained unchanged. Sarah Mitchell was grounded permanently, her pilot's license suspended indefinitely, her entire identity stripped away by federal regulation and psychiatric diagnosis. The worst part wasn't losing her career, it was retaining all the knowledge, all the skill, all the muscle memory that made her a pilot while being legally prohibited from using any of it. She still dreamed in flight patterns. She still calculated crosswind corrections automatically when she saw flags moving in the breeze. She still felt that particular combination of anticipation and calm whenever she heard jet engines spooling up. But she wasn't allowed to fly. Not commercially, not privately, not at all. She was a pilot without permission to pilot, a surgeon whose hands still knew exactly how to save lives but who was forbidden from touching a scalpel. Today she was flying to San Francisco to sign the final papers selling her father's house, the house where she'd grown up dreaming about aviation, where she'd built model planes and memorized aircraft specifications and known with absolute certainty what she was meant to become. Her father had died 6 months ago without ever seeing her fly again, without ever witnessing her redemption, his last words to her a gentle insistence that she was still a pilot no matter what any federal agency claimed. The tears on her face were for him, for her lost career, for the person she used to be and would never be again, for the horrible permanence of her grounding and the way it felt like dying without the mercy of actually being dead. Flight 1842 from Boston to San Francisco carried 189 souls including crew, a Boeing 737-800 cruising at 37,000 feet over the Missouri plains with clear skies ahead and nothing in the weather report suggesting anything but routine travel. Sarah barely noticed takeoff, barely registered the climb to cruising altitude, her attention fixed on the window and the clouds below that looked like mountains she would never again navigate from the cockpit. Other passengers read books, worked on laptops, watched movies on seatback screens, lived their normal lives at 600 miles per hour while she mourned in seat 9B. The man in 9A had offered her a sympathetic smile during boarding but said nothing, respecting her obvious need for solitude. The teenager in 9C wore headphones that leaked tinny music into the cabin while he slept with his mouth slightly open. Sarah existed between them like a ghost, present but separate, too wrapped up in her own devastation to notice the ordinary human drama unfolding in every row around her. 2 hours into the flight, somewhere over Nebraska, everything changed in the span of 30 seconds. The cockpit door had been closed for the last hour, standard procedure during cruise, nothing unusual about the silence from the flight deck or the way the aircraft maintained its altitude with the autopilot engaged. Then suddenly there was a sound that didn't belong, a thump, heavy and wrong, followed by an electronic chime that indicated something had changed in the cockpit. Then another thump. Then silence that felt different from the normal silence, thicker somehow, weighted with implications that nobody in the passenger cabin could yet understand. The senior flight attendant, a woman named Jennifer with 20 years of experience and a practiced smile, walked toward the cockpit with routine professionalism, probably expecting to find a pilot needed the lavatory or wanted coffee. She entered the security code, opened the door, and Sarah watched her expression change from professional pleasantness to something approaching horror. Jennifer disappeared into the cockpit for 15 seconds that felt much longer. When she emerged, her face had gone pale beneath her makeup, her practiced composure cracking visibly. She moved quickly to the intercom handset, and Sarah watched her hands shake as she pressed the button. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a priority announcement." Jennifer's voice tried for calm but couldn't quite achieve it. "We need immediate assistance in the cockpit. If there are any pilots aboard this aircraft, any individuals with aviation experience, please identify yourselves to flight crew immediately. This is an emergency situation requiring immediate response." The cabin erupted into confused murmuring that quickly escalated into frightened voices and rising panic. Passengers looked at each other with growing terror, the implications of that announcement spreading through the rows like wildfire. No pilots available meant the people flying the plane weren't available, which meant nobody was flying the plane, which meant they were going to die at 37,000 feet with nothing to stop the inevitable descent into catastrophe. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a physical sensation like tectonic plates moving, like the Earth's crust breaking apart to reveal something molten underneath. The tears on her face were suddenly irrelevant, the grief that had consumed her since boarding now background noise compared to the absolute clarity flooding through her consciousness. 189 people were about to die. She was a grounded pilot with 8,000 hours of experience and every qualification needed to save them except the legal permission to do so. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. She stood up from seat 9B while the man in 9A stared at her with the kind of fear people have when they've realized death is imminent. Sarah's hands weren't quite steady, but her voice was clear when she spoke to Jennifer, who had started moving through the cabin with desperate eyes searching for anyone who might save them. "I can do this," Sarah said quietly, the words feeling both inadequate and absolute. "I'm a pilot. Former commercial captain. 8,000 hours. I can do this." Jennifer's expression shifted from desperation to hope to confusion in rapid succession. "Former. Are you currently? I'm grounded. Medical disqualification. But I'm the only pilot on this aircraft who's conscious. Sarah kept her voice steady, letting the reality speak for itself. You need to let me into that cockpit right now, or everyone on this plane dies. My legal status doesn't matter if we're all dead. Jennifer made the decision in less than 3 seconds, which Sarah respected. Regulations existed for good reasons, but regulations meant nothing to corpses. Jennifer grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the front of the aircraft while passengers shouted questions and demands, while the cabin filled with the kind of panic that precedes mass casualties, while the aircraft continued flying on autopilot with nobody conscious in the cockpit to intervene if anything went wrong. Sarah stepped through the cockpit door and immediately assessed the situation with the detached professionalism her training had drilled into her nervous system. The captain slumped forward over the controls, unconscious, his face gray and his breathing shallow. The first officer had fallen backward in his seat, head lolling to one side, completely unresponsive. Both of them were alive but deeply unconscious from what Sarah immediately recognized as possible hypoxia or rapid decompression, though the cabin pressure seemed stable now. The autopilot was engaged, thank God, keeping the aircraft at altitude and on course, but autopilots didn't handle emergencies, didn't make decisions, didn't land aircraft. That required a conscious human being with thousands of hours of training and the ability to think through crisis, and right now Sarah was the only person aboard who met those requirements regardless of what the FAA's Medical Certification Division had determined 5 years ago. She grabbed the captain under his arms and pulled him from his seat with Jennifer's help, the man's body heavy and awkward, getting him clear of the controls while her mind ran through procedures she hadn't actively used in 5 years but which remained intact in her muscle memory, like how to ride a bicycle or swim. She slid into the captain's seat, and the moment her hands touched the controls she felt something that had been broken inside her suddenly remember what wholeness felt like. Her fingers found the radio controls automatically, her training overriding her grounded status because human survival took precedence over federal regulation. Denver Center, this is Flight 1842 declaring emergency, dual pilot incapacitation, former commercial captain taking controls, request vectors for nearest suitable airport and emergency services on standby. The response came back within seconds, the air traffic controller's voice tight with controlled stress. Flight 1842, Denver Center, understand dual pilot incapacitation, confirm you're qualified to command the aircraft? I'm a grounded commercial captain with 8,000 hours, last flew 5 years ago, medical certificate revoked for psychological reasons that don't affect my technical capability. Sarah kept her voice professional, stating facts without emotion. I have 189 souls aboard who will die without intervention. I'm your only option. I need approach vectors and I need them now. There was a pause that lasted maybe 3 seconds but felt eternal, and Sarah could imagine the controller's supervisor getting involved, the emergency protocols being activated, the legal questions being raised even as everyone involved understood that legal questions were luxuries for after the crisis, not during it. Then the controller's voice returned, steady and professional. Flight 1842, you're cleared for emergency approach Denver International, vectors following, emergency services standing by, descend and maintain flight level 240. Sarah's hands moved across the controls with the kind of precision that surprised her, muscle memory proving more reliable than conscious thought, her fingers adjusting throttle and trim while she disconnected the autopilot and felt the aircraft respond to her inputs like a living thing she'd forgotten she knew how to communicate with. The Boeing 737 was heavier than she remembered, the controls requiring more force than her last aircraft, but the fundamentals were identical and her body knew what to do even if her conscious mind was flooded with fear and adrenaline and the horrible awareness that 189 lives depended on her not making any of the mistakes that had gotten her grounded in the first place. Behind her in the cabin, Jennifer had made an announcement that probably created more panic than it resolved, telling passengers that a qualified pilot was now in command but that both the captain and first officer were unconscious, creating the kind of situation where honesty seemed necessary but terrifying. Sarah heard raised voices, heard someone crying, heard the teenager from 9C asking his mother if they were going to die. She couldn't think about them. She could only think about airspeed and altitude and descent rate and the approach vectors the controller was feeding her while she guided the aircraft through 37,000 feet toward an emergency landing she hadn't attempted in 5 years. The descent was controlled but faster than passenger comfort would normally allow, Sarah pushing the aircraft's limits because time mattered more than turbulence when dealing with incapacitated pilots and possible ongoing medical emergency. The controller's voice remained calm in her headset, providing vectors and altitude assignments while she hand-flew the aircraft through procedures she'd performed thousands of times before her grounding, her hands steady now that crisis had replaced grief, purpose overriding the devastation that had consumed her in Seat 9B. Flight 1842, turn right heading 270, descend and maintain 10,000, you're 15 miles from initial approach fix. The controller's voice was her lifeline, the professional detachment keeping her focused on procedures rather than the magnitude of what she was attempting. Behind her, Jennifer had gotten the unconscious pilots into the cabin and was coordinating with the other flight attendants to prepare passengers for emergency landing, following protocols that existed precisely for situations like this even though situations like this were supposed to be virtually impossible in modern aviation. Sarah ran through the approach checklist from memory, her voice speaking the items aloud to the empty cockpit because procedures existed for good reasons and following them precisely gave her the best chance of bringing everyone down alive. Landing gear, flaps, speed, altitude. Wind correction. Every item checked and verified while her hands maintained the approach profile and her eyes scanned instruments that felt both completely familiar and terrifyingly foreign after 5 years away from professional flying. The runway appeared in her windscreen at exactly the moment the controller said it would, a strip of concrete that looked impossibly small from this altitude, the visual approach requiring her to judge distance and descent rate without the second pilot who would normally be calling out altitudes and speeds. She was doing both jobs simultaneously, flying and monitoring, making decisions and executing them, the workload immense but manageable because her training had prepared her for exactly this kind of single-pilot emergency even if she'd never imagined implementing it while grounded. The final approach was rougher than she wanted, the crosswind pushing the aircraft while she corrected with rudder and aileron, fighting the Boeing's momentum while maintaining the glide slope that would bring her to the touchdown zone. Her hands were sweating inside her grip on the controls. Her heart was hammering so hard she could hear blood rushing in her ears. 5 years since her last landing. 189 people depending on her not to repeat the mistakes that had ended her career. She crossed the runway threshold at exactly the right altitude and airspeed, then flared the aircraft with a motion her hands remembered even if her conscious mind was screaming that she was going to fail, that she was going to kill everyone the same way her last emergency had nearly killed everyone. That being grounded meant she wasn't capable of this and attempting it was going to prove the FAA had been right to take away her certification. The main landing gear touched concrete harder than a commercial landing should be, the impact jarring through the airframe, passengers probably screaming in the cabin but Sarah couldn't hear them over the sound of her own breathing and the roar of reverse thrust as she deployed the engines to slow their forward momentum. The nose gear came down firmly, not smoothly, the aircraft bouncing slightly before settling onto the runway while Sarah fought the controls to keep them centered on the pavement. She'd landed the aircraft. Roughly, imperfectly, with none of the smoothness passengers expected from commercial aviation, but she'd landed it with all 189 souls still alive and the aircraft still intact and controllable. Her hands were shaking now that the immediate crisis had passed, adrenaline flooding her system with nowhere to go, her breathing coming in gasps that she tried to control while she guided the crippled aircraft off the runway toward the waiting emergency vehicles. The moment she stopped the aircraft and shut down the engines, Sarah's professional composure shattered. She doubled over in the captain's seat, her hands still gripping the controls, and started crying with the kind of intensity that came from 5 years of suppressed grief finally finding release. She'd saved them. All of them. She'd done the one thing her grounding had told her she was unfit to do, and she'd succeeded despite the FAA's determination that she wasn't psychologically capable of handling the stress of emergency aviation. The cockpit door opened and Jennifer appeared with tears streaming down her face, pulling Sarah into a fierce embrace while emergency personnel swarmed the aircraft and passengers began evacuating through the emergency slides with the kind of chaos that followed crisis survival. Sarah let herself be held for 30 seconds, let herself feel the magnitude of what she'd just done, then gently pulled away and stood up because there were still procedures to follow, still debriefings to complete, still the reality of what came next now that the emergency was over. What came next was arrest. The FAA representatives arrived before Sarah had even left the airport, their faces grim with the kind of bureaucratic determination that suggested they viewed her emergency intervention not as heroism but as criminal violation of federal aviation regulations. They informed her that she was being detained for operating a commercial aircraft without proper medical certification, for violating the terms of her grounding, for unauthorized assumption of pilot command regardless of the circumstances that had necessitated her intervention. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She'd saved 189 lives, had prevented what would have been a catastrophic crash and major aviation disaster, had done exactly what any pilot would have done in her situation, and she was being arrested for it. The passengers she'd saved were being interviewed by media outside the terminal, telling reporters about the crying woman from seat 9B who had whispered she could do this and then proceeded to save everyone aboard. Their gratitude was real and overwhelming, but gratitude didn't override federal regulations that she had unquestionably violated. The trial took 8 months to prepare and 3 weeks to execute, becoming a media sensation that divided public opinion between those who saw Sarah as a hero who had saved lives and those who argued that allowing grounded pilots to violate their certifications for any reason undermined aviation safety and established dangerous precedents. The prosecution argued that Sarah had knowingly violated federal aviation regulations, that her grounded status existed for legitimate safety reasons, and that permitting rule violations during emergencies would encourage other disqualified pilots to attempt interventions they weren't medically cleared to perform. The defense argued necessity doctrine, that Sarah had faced an impossible choice between allowing 189 people to die or violating regulations that, in the specific context of dual pilot incapacitation, became morally indefensible. They brought in the survivors as witnesses, the air traffic controller who had guided her down, aviation experts who testified that her technical performance had been competent despite the rough landing, and psychiatrists who argued that her depression and anxiety were situational responses to losing her career rather than indicators of fundamental incapacity to command aircraft during emergencies. Sarah sat through the trial feeling disconnected from the proceedings, as if they were discussing someone else's life rather than her own. She'd done what any pilot would have done in her situation. She'd saved the people she could save using the skills she possessed, regardless of whether federal regulations permitted her to use those skills. The moral mathematics seemed straightforward to her. 189 lives saved was infinitely better than 189 lives lost because she'd chosen regulatory compliance over human survival. The jury deliberated for 4 days before reaching a verdict that satisfied nobody completely. They found her guilty of violating federal aviation regulations but recommended no jail time given the extraordinary circumstances of the emergency. The judge sentenced her to 5 years probation and permanently banned her from ever holding any form of pilot certification again, ensuring that her brief return to the cockpit would be her last. The survivors had raised money for her legal defense, had written letters to the judge pleading for leniency, had started a petition asking the FAA to restore her medical certificate based on her demonstrated competence during the emergency. The petition gained 3 million signatures in 6 weeks and made no difference whatsoever to the federal agency's determination that Sarah Mitchell was permanently unfit to command aircraft regardless of what she'd proven herself capable of during Flight 1842. Sarah returned to her small apartment in Boston and tried to figure out who she was now, not a pilot, never going to be a pilot again, but also not quite the devastated woman who had boarded Flight 1842 crying in grief over her lost identity. She'd discovered something important in that cockpit, something the FAA couldn't regulate or the courts couldn't take away. She'd learned that being grounded didn't mean her skills were gone, that losing her certification didn't erase her training, that the person she'd been as a pilot still existed somewhere inside her even if she could never officially pilot an aircraft again. The teenager from seat 9C wrote her a letter 6 months after the trial, thanking her for saving his life and telling her that he'd started taking flying lessons because of what she'd done. The man from 9A sent flowers on the anniversary of the emergency landing with a card that said simply, "You gave me another year with my grandchildren." Jennifer, the senior flight attendant, called occasionally to check on her and insisted that Sarah was the bravest person she'd ever met regardless of what any federal regulation claimed. The months following the trial brought unexpected developments that complicated Sarah's attempt to rebuild a life outside aviation. A documentary filmmaker contacted her wanting to tell her story, seeing in her journey a powerful narrative about institutional rigidity versus human judgment. She declined initially, uncomfortable with the attention, but eventually agreed when she realized the film might help other grounded pilots understand they weren't alone in their grief over lost careers. During the filming, she had to revisit the details of that day, walking through her emotional state in seat 9B, describing the moment she heard Jennifer's desperate announcement, explaining the split-second decision to violate her grounding because regulatory compliance seemed obscene when measured against mass death. The director asked her to visit a flight simulator to demonstrate what she'd done that day, and Sarah found herself back at controls for the first time since the emergency landing, her hands shaking as muscle memory flooded through her with painful intensity. The simulator session revealed something unexpected. Her technical skills remained sharp despite the years of forced absence from cockpits, her decision-making under simulated pressure was sound, and her ability to manage complex emergencies exceeded many currently certified pilots. The simulation instructor, a veteran captain with 30 years of experience, told her bluntly that her grounding made no sense from a competency standpoint, that she was demonstrably capable of commanding aircraft safely, and that the FAA's refusal to consider reinstating her certification represented bureaucratic inflexibility rather than legitimate safety concerns. But capability and permission remained entirely separate things in aviation regulation. Sarah was capable of flying, the emergency landing had proven that beyond doubt, the simulator session had confirmed it objectively. Yet she would never receive permission to fly commercially again because federal regulations treated psychological grounds for medical disqualification as permanent regardless of demonstrated recovery or proven competence under actual emergency conditions. The documentary premiered at a major film festival and won awards for its examination of how aviation regulations sometimes conflicted with common sense and moral necessity. It showed Sarah's tears in seat 9B, included cockpit voice recordings from her emergency landing that captured her professional composure under impossible pressure, and featured interviews with survivors who described watching her walk toward the cockpit with tears still wet on her face and emerge hours later having saved everyone aboard. The film's success brought renewed public attention to her case and reignited debates about whether aviation regulations needed reform to account for situations where disqualified pilots represented the only alternative to catastrophic death. Advocacy groups formed demanding the FAA create emergency exceptions for grounded pilots facing dual incapacitation scenarios. Aviation safety experts argued both sides passionately, some insisting that any compromise to medical certification standards would undermine aviation safety, others maintaining that Sarah's successful intervention proved some groundings were excessive and that demonstrated competence should override bureaucratic determinations of unfitness. Sarah became an unwilling spokesperson for grounded pilots worldwide, receiving emails and letters from hundreds of people whose careers had ended through medical disqualification, whose identities had been stripped away by regulatory decisions, who understood the specific grief of possessing skills they were forbidden to use. Many of them had been grounded for reasons that seemed disconnected from actual flight safety, minor medical conditions, past psychological treatment, disabilities that didn't affect their capacity to command aircraft but which triggered automatic disqualification under rigid federal standards. She started speaking at aviation conferences about the psychological impact of losing pilot certification, describing the unique devastation of watching other people do the job you were trained for while knowing you possessed equivalent or superior capability but lacked permission to demonstrate it. Her talks were brutally honest about her depression following her grounding, her sense of worthlessness when her entire identity dissolved, the years of grief she'd experienced before Flight 1842 gave her devastation an unexpected purpose. Some active pilots criticized her advocacy, arguing that she was encouraging dangerous disregard for medical certification requirements and that her success during one emergency didn't prove she was fit for regular commercial flying. They pointed out that regulations existed because aviation safety required conservative approaches to risk, that psychological conditions could be unpredictable and dangerous at altitude, and that her emergency intervention had been performed under acute stress that might have masked underlying instability that would emerge during routine operations. Sarah didn't disagree with their concerns entirely. She understood that aviation safety required careful evaluation of pilot fitness, that depression and anxiety could genuinely impair judgment and decision-making, and that her medical disqualification hadn't been arbitrary persecution but rather a regulatory response to legitimate questions about her psychological state following her original incident. What she questioned was the permanence of such determinations, the refusal to consider that people could recover from mental health struggles, and the absolute nature of regulations that made no allowance for demonstrated competence or changed circumstances. The debate reached Congress, where representatives proposed legislation creating limited pathways for medically disqualified pilots to regain certification through rigorous demonstration of recovered fitness. The proposed law would require extensive psychological evaluation, simulator testing, and supervised flight hours, but would permit reconsideration of permanent groundings in cases where pilots could objectively prove their capability had been restored. The legislation was named the Sarah Mitchell Aviation Safety and Second Chances Act, though Sarah herself felt uncomfortable with the eponymous honor given that she remained convicted of federal aviation violations. The bill faced intense opposition from aviation regulatory agencies who argued that creating exceptions to medical certification would establish dangerous precedents and undermine the predictability essential to aviation safety standards. It also faced opposition from some pilot unions who worried that pressure to return psychologically recovering pilots to service would create unsafe cockpit environments. The legislation stalled in committee, amended into meaninglessness by competing interests, and eventually died without reaching a full congressional vote. Sarah watched the legislative failure with resignation rather than surprise. She'd never expected her case to change aviation regulations, had never believed that one emergency intervention would be sufficient to overcome decades of established bureaucratic practice and legitimate safety concerns. What she had gained from the entire experience wasn't vindication or policy reform but rather a more nuanced understanding of her own identity and worth. She was a pilot not because the FAA certified her but because she possessed knowledge, skills, and instincts that existed independent of regulatory permission. She'd saved 189 lives not because she had legal authority to do so but because she had moral responsibility and technical capability that made inaction unconscionable. And she'd learned that sometimes heroism meant accepting permanent consequences for temporary choices, that doing the right thing didn't guarantee recognition or reward, and that her value as a person wasn't determined by whether federal agencies acknowledged her competence. 2 years after Flight 1842, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from an aviation safety consulting firm offering her a position as an emergency procedures instructor. They wanted her to train active pilots on psychological resilience during crisis situations, to share her experience of managing overwhelming stress while performing complex technical tasks, and to help commercial aviators understand that mental health challenges didn't necessarily equate to professional incompetence. The position wouldn't allow her to fly, but it would let her contribute to aviation safety in meaningful ways while earning income doing something connected to her lost career. She accepted the job and discovered an unexpected talent for teaching. Her students were active commercial pilots who initially approached her classes with skepticism. Why should they learn from someone whose career had ended in failure and whose only notable success had involved breaking federal regulations? But Sarah's brutal honesty about her mistakes, her willingness to dissect her own psychological collapse and subsequent recovery, and her demonstrated ability to perform under impossible pressure gradually won their respect. She taught them that acknowledging mental health struggles didn't make pilots weak but rather made them more aware of their own limitations and more prepared to manage psychological stress during actual emergencies. She showed them simulator scenarios similar to what she'd faced, walking them through her decision-making process during Flight 1842 while emphasizing that her technical competence had remained intact even when her emotional state had been devastated. Her classes became some of the highest rated in the consulting firm's training program, with pilots reporting that her instruction had fundamentally changed how they thought about the relationship between psychological wellness and flight safety. The work gave Sarah something she hadn't expected to find again, a sense of purpose connected to aviation that existed outside the cockpit. She was contributing to safety, helping pilots become more effective during emergencies, and using her experience of failure and redemption to make commercial aviation marginally safer for everyone who flew. It wasn't the same as commanding aircraft, would never replace the feeling of controls responding to her hands or the satisfaction of executing a perfect landing. But it was meaningful work that honored her training and her experience while accepting the reality that she would never be certified to fly commercially again. On the third anniversary of Flight 1842, the survivors organized a reunion and invited Sarah as the guest of honor. She almost declined, uncomfortable with the hero worship she knew would accompany the gathering, but Jennifer convinced her that the survivors needed to thank her in person, needed to show her that her choice had created families and futures that wouldn't have existed if she'd chosen regulatory compliance over their lives. The reunion was held in Denver, near the airport where she'd made the emergency landing. 163 of the 189 survivors attended, along with family members born after the incident who existed only because Sarah had violated her grounding 3 years earlier. The teenager from Seat 9C was there, now studying aerospace engineering and planning to become a pilot himself. The man from 9A brought his grandchildren, the ones Sarah had given him extra years to know. Jennifer organized everything with the same professional competence she'd shown during the emergency, creating an event that honored Sarah's intervention without ignoring the complexity of her situation. They presented Sarah with a plaque engraved with all 189 names, calling her the pilot who chose lives over regulations. She gave a brief speech that tried to articulate how their survival had transformed her grief into something bearable, how knowing that her violation of federal aviation regulations had created tangible good in the world made the legal consequences feel meaningful rather than purely punitive. She told them that she still cried sometimes about her lost career, still felt the ache of being permanently grounded, but that their presence made her certain she'd made the right choice regardless of what it had cost her professionally. After the formal presentations ended, individual survivors approached her with stories about what the 3 years since the emergency had brought them. A woman who had been pregnant during the flight introduced Sarah to her daughter, a beautiful 2-year-old who would never have been born if the aircraft had crashed. A businessman explained that surviving the incident had prompted him to quit his corporate job and start the non-profit he'd always dreamed about, making him realize that postponing meaningful work was a luxury people didn't always get. An elderly couple held Sarah's hands and told her simply that she'd given them time they'd thought was finished, time they'd used to repair a damaged relationship with their son and meet grandchildren they'd been estranged from for years. Each story reinforced what Sarah had begun to understand during her 2 years of teaching, that her moment in the cockpit had created ripples extending far beyond the immediate survival of 189 passengers. Those survivors had gone on to live lives, make choices, create relationships, and generate impacts that wouldn't have existed without her intervention. The mathematics of her decision had involved not just the people aboard Flight 1842 but everyone those people would touch, influence, or create in all the years she'd given them by choosing moral necessity over regulatory compliance. The reunion also brought unexpected closure regarding the unconscious pilots from that day. Captain Richard Torres and First Officer Michael Chen both attended, having recovered fully from what investigators determined had been a carbon monoxide leak in the cockpit that had rendered them unconscious while leaving the cabin unaffected. They sought Sarah out specifically to thank her, both men understanding that their own lives had been saved by her willingness to violate regulations on their behalf. Torres told her that he'd testified during her trial arguing for complete dismissal of charges, that he'd written letters to the FAA requesting they reconsider her medical certification, and that he felt personally responsible for the legal consequences she'd faced despite having been unconscious during the emergency. Sarah assured him that she held no resentment about the outcome, that she understood the complexity of aviation regulations and accepted that her intervention had required punishment even though it had prevented catastrophe. She told both pilots that seeing them alive and healthy made everything worthwhile, that knowing her decision had saved not just passengers but also her fellow aviators gave her a sense of professional completion that medical certification could never have provided. That evening, standing alone on the hotel balcony overlooking the Denver skyline with the mountains visible in the distance, Sarah felt something shift inside her that had remained broken since her original grounding 5 years earlier. She would never fly commercially again. The FAA would never restore her certification. Her career as an airline captain was permanently finished, erased by regulatory decisions that no amount of demonstrated competence could override. But she was still a pilot in every way that mattered. Her knowledge hadn't disappeared. Her skills remained sharp. Her instincts were intact. And she'd used all of those things to save lives when lives needed saving, proving to herself if not to federal regulators that her grounding had been about bureaucratic necessity rather than actual incompetence. The woman who had boarded Flight 1842 crying in Seat 9B had been devastated by loss of identity, but the woman standing on this balcony 3 years later understood that identity couldn't be granted or revoked by external authorities, that who she was existed independent of what she was permitted to do. She thought about the plaque now sitting in her hotel room with 189 names engraved on metal, each name representing a life that continued because she'd whispered, "I can do this," and then proved it despite every regulation telling her she wasn't qualified to try. She thought about the 2-year-old girl whose existence depended on Sarah's willingness to break federal aviation law. She thought about the reconciled family, the launched nonprofit, the student pilot inspired by her example, and the countless other impacts rippling outward from her decision in ways she would never fully know or understand. The mountains in the distance were the same mountains she'd been descending toward 3 years ago with 189 terrified passengers behind her and nothing ahead but the desperate hope that her training would be sufficient despite 5 years away from cockpits. She'd been terrified that day, had been certain she would fail, had known that attempting the landing meant risking not just her own life but the lives of everyone aboard. But she'd done it anyway because the alternative, watching everyone die when she possessed the capability to save them, had been morally unacceptable regardless of legal considerations. Jennifer called while Sarah stood on the balcony, wanting to check that she was handling the emotional intensity of the reunion. Sarah assured her she was fine, better than fine actually, that seeing the survivors had given her a sense of peace she hadn't expected to find. They talked for 20 minutes about the event, about specific survivors whose stories had been particularly moving, about how strange and wonderful it felt to see the tangible results of that desperate emergency intervention 3 years after the fact. Before hanging up, Jennifer said something that would stay with Sarah for years afterward. "You know what I remember most about that day? Not the panic or the fear or even the relief when we landed. I remember watching you walk from Seat 9B toward the cockpit with tears still on your face, and thinking that you looked like someone who had just remembered who they were. Like you'd been lost and suddenly found yourself again." Sarah kept the letters and cards in a box under her bed, evidence that her violation of aviation regulations had meaning beyond legal consequences, that sometimes the right thing to do conflicted with the permitted thing to do, and that choosing human survival over regulatory compliance was worth the price she'd paid for making that choice. She still cried sometimes, still grieved the career she would never have again, still felt the ache of being a pilot without permission to pilot. But she also knew something now that she hadn't known in Seat 9B before the emergency, that her identity as a pilot existed independent of federal certification, that the skills defining her remained real even when regulations said she couldn't use them, and that one perfect moment of doing exactly what she'd been trained to do had been worth all the years of grief and loss that had preceded it. She was Sarah Mitchell. She was a grounded pilot who had saved 189 lives by choosing moral necessity over legal compliance. She was the woman from Seat 9B who had whispered, "I can do this," and then proceeded to prove it despite every regulation and restriction telling her she was unfit to try. And she was someone who had learned that heroism sometimes meant accepting consequences for doing the right thing regardless of whether the right thing was technically permitted. The FAA would never restore her certification. The courts would never overturn her conviction. The regulations she had violated would never change to accommodate the unique circumstances of her emergency intervention. But the 189 people who had survived Flight 1842 knew what she'd done, and their survival was the only validation Sarah needed for the choice she'd made at 37,000 feet when everything in her training told her to save lives and everything in her legal status told her she wasn't allowed to try. She was still a pilot. Always had been. Always would be. Just not one the federal government permitted to fly.